In the dead of night, on August 24th, the impenetrable gates of the world's greatest superpower slowly swung open. But they weren't smashed down by catapults, nor were they breached by a massive siege engine. Instead, they were quietly unlocked from the inside by Rome's own desperate, starving citizens. For 3 agonizing days, a foreign army poured into the streets, systematically plundering the eternal city, stripping gold from the temples, and burning the grand villas of the elite. To the ancient world, this was an unthinkable cosmic catastrophe, equivalent to the sky falling. For centuries, we have been taught a simple, direct explanation for this nightmare. That bloodthirsty barbarian hordes swept across the borders and burned a magnificent civilization to the ground. But what if everything you have been told about the collapse of Rome is completely wrong? What if the real killer wasn't an invading army at all, but an invisible, slow-acting poison that the Romans have been willingly feeding to themselves for generations? To understand the true nature of this civilizational suicide, we have to look past the grand battles and peer into the dark, smoky rooms of the Imperial Mint.
The Mystery Ledger.
Imagine waking up in a metropolis of concrete, marble, and hyper-advanced plumbing, completely unaware that the world around you is irreversibly rotting from within. At its peak, the Roman Empire was home to over 70 million people, holding nearly 20% of the entire human population under a single, ironclad system of law and commerce. It was a civilization so blindingly advanced that its citizens enjoyed heated floors, pristine aqueducts, and global trade networks that wouldn't be seen again on Earth for another 1,000 years. The absolute bedrock of this entire multi-continental superpower was a single silver coin called the denarius. It was the currency that paid the legions, bought the grain, and bound distant provinces together in unshakable trust. Under the reign of Augustus, the denarius was almost pure, glistening silver. If you held that coin in your hand, you held the unyielding promise of the emperor himself. But the real story of Rome's economic destruction begins with an insatiable, dangerous hunger. Rome was never built to be a sustainable nation. It was designed from its very inception as a giant, wealth-consuming machine that required a constant influx of newly conquered lands, stolen gold, and enslaved laborers just to keep the lights on. But what happens when a machine built for endless growth suddenly runs out of room to grow? When the empire finally hit its absolute geographic limits, reaching the rainy deserts of Scotland and the hostile sands of Persia, the endless river of foreign plunder ran completely dry. Yet, the expenses of maintaining a massive standing army and a bloated bureaucracy kept growing larger by the day. It was at this exact moment of desperation that Emperor Nero made a choice that would alter the course of human history forever. Facing an empty treasury, Nero looked at the pure silver denarius and saw a dangerous opportunity. He ordered the imperial mint to secretly mix a small amount of copper into the silver coins. To the untrained eye of an ordinary Roman citizen, the coin looked exactly the same. It weighed the same, it jingled the same in a leather pouch, and it bore the proud face of the Caesar. But beneath that deceptive surface, the core trust that held the empire together had just been fatally compromised. What happened next changed everything, setting off a catastrophic chain reaction that no leader could stop. Succeeding emperors looked at Nero's trick and realized they could use it as a personal piggy bank to fund their own lavish lifestyles and buy the temporary loyalty of the military. With each passing decade, the silver content of the Roman currency plunged lower and lower. By the middle of the 3rd century, the once proud denarius had degenerated into a worthless piece of junk containing less than 5% precious metal. It was essentially a copper coin washed in a microscopic layer of silver that literally rubbed off after just a few weeks of circulating in the marketplace. Imagine being a Roman baker, working 18 hours a day over a scorching stone oven, only to realize that the coins your customers are handing you are losing their value by the hour. Naturally, the citizens weren't stupid. They saw the deception, and prices skyrocketed to astronomical heights. Hyperinflation tore through the empire like an unstoppable wildfire. In a desperate bid to save themselves, shopkeepers refused to accept the imperial currency altogether, turning away angry customers who offered official Roman coins. The entire monetary system collapsed into absolute chaos. The empire was forced to slide backward into a primitive barter system, where people traded cows for wheat and cloaks for iron tools. But this was just the beginning of a much deeper, more terrifying crisis. As the money lost its value, the Roman government could no longer afford to pay the very people responsible for keeping the empire alive, the brutal, heavily armed legions guarding the frontiers. Imagine being a Roman soldier stationed on the freezing, windswept banks of the Danube River. You are thousands of miles away from the warmth of Italy, staring into the dark forests of Germania, where hostile eyes watch your every move. You haven't received your full wages in months, and the coins you did receive are worthless scraps of copper. You are hungry, your armor is rusting, and you feel completely abandoned by a corrupt elite lounging in luxury palaces. If a charismatic general steps forward and promises to pay you in real, stolen gold if you march on Rome and overthrow the emperor, what would you do? The answer to that question triggered a period of unprecedented horror known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. Suddenly, the Roman military turned its weapons inward, transforming from a shield against external threats into a predatory monster that consumed its own homeland. In a chaotic 50-year span, the empire suffered through over 50 different emperors and usurpers, each claiming the throne through bloodshed and betrayal. The average life expectancy of a Roman emperor during this era was shorter than that of a frontline infantryman. But the real story is even more shocking. The ultimate symbol of this institutional rot occurred when the Praetorian Guard, the elite group of soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, murdered the ruler of Rome and put the entire Roman Empire up for auction to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Gellinus literally walked up to the military camp, shouted out an astronomical cash offer per soldier, and bought the throne right then and there. And that is where the story takes a dangerous turn. While the Romans were busy slaughtering each other in endless, petty civil wars for the imperial crown, the borders were left wide open. The Germanic tribes looked across the rivers and saw an empire bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. But the breakdown of law and order wasn't the only threat creeping toward the unsuspecting citizens of Rome. Something far more insidious, a series of devastating pandemics swept through the interconnected trade routes of the empire. At its peak, the plague was killing up to 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. Fields were left uncultivated because there were no farmers left alive to plow them. Entire villages became ghost towns, their streets littered with unburied corpses. The tax base completely disintegrated, leaving the shattered government even more bankrupt than before. Was it just a cruel coincidence of nature, or was the universe itself turning against the eternal city? For centuries, Rome had thrived during a unique meteorological anomaly known as the Roman Warm Period, an era of extraordinarily stable, warm weather that allowed crops to flourish across Europe and North Africa. But right around the 3rd century, the climate shifted abruptly. The Earth entered what scientists call the late antique Little Ice Age. Temperatures plummeted, growing seasons shrank, and severe droughts crippled the breadbaskets of the empire. Rome was starving, freezing, and bankrupt all at the same time. To save the dying superpower, a ruthless, brilliant emperor named Diocletian realized that the empire had become too massive, too complex, and too dysfunctional for any single human being to govern. He made a radical decision that solved the immediate problem but laid the groundwork for the ultimate tragedy. Diocletian sliced the Roman Empire completely in half, creating the Western Roman Empire based around Rome and the Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople. At first, this seemed like a stroke of administrative genius. The split allowed leaders to focus on their local borders and stabilize their failing economies. But the real story is much darker. The eastern half of the empire was incredibly wealthy, controlling the lucrative silk and spice trade routes from Asia, while the western half was left with a depleted treasury, exhausted agricultural land, and a crumbling infrastructure. When the ultimate storm finally arrived, the wealthy East made a calculated, cold-blooded decision. They left the West to die. They literally paid massive bribes to the barbarian tribes, redirecting their destructive fury away from Constantinople and sending them marching straight toward the vulnerable, broke cities of the West. But the question is, why did these barbarian tribes suddenly move in such massive, terrifying numbers? For decades, historians painted a picture of savage, bloodthirsty invaders who hated Roman civilization and wanted nothing more than to destroy it. But when we look at the contemporary accounts of the people who actually lived through those dark days, a completely different, heartbreaking reality emerges. The barbarians weren't launching an unprovoked invasion. They were desperate, terrified refugees fleeing for their lives from a nightmare that had risen out of the deep steppes of Asia. An unstoppable, ultra-violent nomadic force known as the Huns had suddenly emerged, sweeping across Eastern Europe with unparalleled brutality. They rode on horseback, shooting deadly composite bows with terrifying accuracy, burning every village in their path, and leaving mountains of skulls behind them. The Germanic tribes, specifically the Goths, found themselves trapped between the advancing meat grinder of the Huns and the stone walls of the Roman Empire. In the freezing winter, tens of thousands of Gothic men, women, and children gathered on the banks of the Danube River, begging the Roman authorities for permission to cross into the empire as refugees. They didn't want to conquer Rome. They wanted Rome to protect them. They were willing to work the vacant fields, pay taxes, and even fight in the Roman army in exchange for safety and food. It was an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, and the choices made by the Roman leadership would seal the fate of their civilization forever. Instead of integrating these desperate people and utilizing their strength, the corrupt Roman governors saw the refugees as a golden opportunity for exploitation and human trafficking. They stripped the Goths of their weapons, forced them into squalid, disease-ridden concentration camps, and withheld food until the refugees were starving. The Roman commanders became so cruel that they forced the desperate Gothic parents to sell their own children into slavery just to buy a single dog carcass to feed their remaining family members. Think about the pure, blinding rage that would build inside you if you were forced to trade your son or daughter for a piece of rotten meat just to survive the night. The Romans thought they could abuse these people with absolute impunity because they were barbarians. They forgot that among those starving refugees were thousands of hardened, veteran warriors who had nothing left to lose. The tension built like a pressure cooker until the Goths finally revolted, turning on their cruel Roman captors with a ferocity born of pure desperation. They managed to smuggle weapons into their camps, organize their forces, and began tearing through the Roman countryside. The emperor himself, Valens, marched out with the elite corps of the Roman army to crush the rebellion at the infamous Battle of Adrianople. He was so arrogant, so convinced of Roman superiority, that he refused to wait for reinforcements from the Western Empire, wanting all the glory for himself. It was a fatal mistake. The Gothic cavalry swept down upon the exhausted, overheated Roman legions, trapping them in a dense, suffocating pocket of slaughter. The defeat was so absolute, so catastrophic, that 2/3 of the Roman army was annihilated in a single afternoon, and Emperor Valens was killed, his body burned beyond recognition in a peasant's cottage where he tried to hide. Adrianople was the moment the illusion of Roman invincibility shattered forever. The empire could no longer defend its own citizens. To survive, the broke Western government was forced to make a dangerous, desperate compromise. They began hiring entire barbarian tribes to serve as the primary defense force of the Roman military. By the final decades of the Western Empire, the army wearing Roman armor, carrying Roman shields, and guarding the imperial palace wasn't actually Roman at all. It was made up of the very people Rome had spent centuries conquering and oppressing. This brings us to the final, terrifying twist in the story of Rome's collapse, a secret that turns the traditional narrative completely on its head. The man who finally brought the Western Roman Empire to its knees wasn't an alien invader from a distant land. His name was Alaric, the king of the Visigoths. But before he was the destroyer of Rome, Alaric was a high-ranking, decorated general in the Roman military itself. He had fought for years under the Roman banner, spilled his own blood for the empire, and deeply admired Roman culture. He didn't want to destroy the empire. He wanted a legitimate place within it for his people, a stable food supply, and the official title of a Roman general. But the arrogant, deeply prejudiced Roman Senate repeatedly broke their promises to him, refusing to pay his soldiers and treating them like second-class citizens. Driven to the absolute brink of frustration, Alaric did the unthinkable. He turned his veteran, Roman-trained army around and marched straight toward the city of Rome. For the first time in 800 years, an enemy army stood outside the gates of the Eternal City. Alaric didn't even have to storm the walls. The city was so crippled by starvation and panic that in the dead of night, desperate slaves inside the city opened the Salarian Gate, letting the Goths pour into the streets. For 3 agonizing days, the city that had plundered the entire world was systematically plundered itself. Yet, when the dust settled, the strangest detail of the sack of Rome was how remarkably gentle it was compared to the horrors Rome had inflicted on others. Alaric, being a Christian and a former Roman officer, ordered his men not to burn the great churches, to spare the lives of the citizens, and to leave the monuments intact. It wasn't a senseless act of barbaric vandalism. It was a cold, calculated political statement. The fall of Rome wasn't a sudden, apocalyptic explosion caused by an external force. It was the quiet, agonizing death of a system that had rotted out from the inside until it could no longer support its own weight. In the year 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer walked into the imperial palace, calmly deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a helpless 16-year-old boy, ironically named Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial insignia to the eastern capital of Constantinople. There was no grand, cinematic final battle. There was no massive wall of fire. The Western Roman Empire simply ceased to exist, not because its enemies were strong, but because its institutions had become too hollow, its leaders too corrupt, and its currency too worthless to give anyone a reason to save it. When you walk among the silent, crumbling ruins of the Roman Forum today, you are not looking at the scars of a foreign invasion. You're looking at the ultimate monument to self-inflicted civilizational suicide. The story of Rome is a chilling warning echoing across the centuries, a reminder that the greatest empires in human history do not fall to the enemies at their gates until they have already destroyed themselves from within. If you were standing in their shoes today, looking at our own modern global systems, our own economies built on currency manipulation, and our own deep social divisions, would you recognize the warning signs before the gates open from the inside?